Well, good afternoon. It is good to be with you all. Very good to be with you all. I'm here today to talk to you about criminal justice reform, which is one of these conservative issues that really defies line drawing within the conservative movement. It's something that I've been working on for over 20 years. I started out in juvenile justice reform in Virginia in the 90s. And sometimes this means being what people would call tougher, and sometimes this means being what some people, especially people who don't like it, would call being softer. But I work with a group called Right on Crime, and that is a sort of a double entendre. And we've got PowerPoint slides here somewhere, and I'm going to just start hitting buttons. Hey, look at that. It worked. And there's your double entendre. Right is we're conservatives, a lot of prosecutors, attorneys general, also policymakers, people like Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist, but Ed Meese as well, as myself, Richard Viguerie, one of the funding father in the conservative movement. It's a broad coalition of people who want to get our criminal justice right, and that is the other part of Right on Crime, is that we want to be correct. Public safety is our top priority. That is our top priority in criminal justice, as it should be. But we're also concerned with the justice part, not just punishment for punishment's sake. And critically, as you look around the country at this issue, frugality is something we bring to the table. It is a tragically rare trait among lawmakers, especially federal lawmakers who do not have balanced budget requirements. Part of being right is that we are data-driven. We look for evidence basis to undertake policy changes. And that means they're already proven. We're not coming to the table with pie-in-the-sky ideas that we say, oh, this will just cure all our ills, it's some silver bullet. I'll give you an example. Before I was Attorney General of Virginia, I was a state senator for 8 years, and I voted against drug courts year after year after year. I was on the Courts of Justice Committee there. And the simple reason was there was no data showing that they worked. Well, here, 8 years later, there is. And I've changed my opinion on the proper use of drug courts because there is evidence that they work. What a great idea, using, facts and things. What a concept. That's why we're not meeting in Washington, of course. But if you compare that to what you hear, say, on the left, and I have been at forums with people from the left. I remember one in particular with an ACLU person who got up, this was in Virginia, said we need 25% less people in Virginia's prisons. Well, where the heck did that come from? Which 25%, and where did you get that number? And of course, I know the answer to that, and I don't want to go into that. But that's why data and evidence of success is so important. Yes, it would be nice to have less prisoners if that accompanied better public safety. And I can point to you to states where that has happened, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Right on Crime brings legislative support. We bring expert witnesses to hearings and so forth, and we bring the experience of gathering this data and of what works to aid our allies in states, which is mostly where criminal justice reform is taking place. And over 90% of all prisoners in America are state and local prisoners. They are not federal. This is overwhelmingly, numerically, a state issue. It'd be kind of nice if more things were just considered overwhelmingly a state issue. We'd make more headway. Because in a lot of red states, we're making headway on a number of issues. So why should the right lead on criminal justice reform? The simple answer is that only the right can get it right. And that sounds very simple, but when you look at what the left does and how they operate, I don't need to convince you all here that that's true. If you look at practicalities of the left versus the right spearheading criminal justice reform, the example I always use is go back to that state legislator example. So say I'm a Virginia state senator, I'm waving around a bill, and I've said, this has worked great in – California. Yeah, I heard that. What kind of enthusiasm does that generate among conservatives? What kind of confidence does that instill you with? I'll tell you what, it doesn't instill me with any confidence. But we're in a position where we can start and say, oftentimes, this has worked in states like Texas. No one is going to, yeah, a little parochial cheer there. Nobody is going to mistake Texas for some place that is soft on crime. And that is very helpful in marketing, in branding, in credibility. Because we now have 10 years of data out of Texas, almost 10 years of data, 9 years of data out of Texas from their criminal justice reform efforts. And where did they come from? They came from a tight budget. Oh my gosh, we actually have to prioritize. And they were staring down the barrel of 3 new prisons, billions of dollars of additional spending that they knew they didn't have the money for. So necessity and frugality drove them to develop alternatives and programs and methods that have reduced their rate of crime and reduced their criminal justice budget at the same time. At the same time. Now, budget arguments are a great example of something you will never really hear from the left. Money grows on trees, right? They don't care about this. I always find it kind of amusing when a lefty comes in to try to convince righties and they try to start making budget arguments. They're so poorly grounded in the subject. It's so obvious how fake it is. They get nowhere. They get nowhere. Again, it's part of why conservatives need to lead. No one trusts the left on public safety. No one trusts the left on frugality. There is much more trust of the right to maintain public safety as a priority and to actually be frugal. Now, all of us here have our problems with Republican leadership failing to be frugal, but by way of comparison with the left, we do look a whole lot better, especially when conservatives are leading. The other problem, I talked about right on crime, we deal with data and reality, what works, what doesn't. The left is all rhetoric in this area. They're all rhetoric. They don't care about facts. They don't even want to know the facts oftentimes. It's a hard thing to listen to for an idealist who actually wants to be right. And they don't help with that. Conservatives bring a lot of different things to the table here that the left will never bring. I would note this. The left is useful here in delivering their votes. Just setting too much detail about the federal bills aside for the moment and just think about the politics. We have a president who wants to sign what he can call a criminal justice reform bill. If we deliver a conservative criminal justice reform bill, he will sign it. It's like Bill Clinton, the third time on welfare reform. There wasn't much different about the welfare reform bill in 1996, except that he really wanted to sign a welfare reform bill in 1996. And so he did. And we have a president who, for legacy reasons, wants to sign a criminal justice reform bill. Well, let's put a conservative bill on his desk that does the right things with our criminal justice system and, by the way, parts of our regulatory system that are criminalizing a lot of what would otherwise be regulatory activity, and force him to sign it. That is my kind of compromise. They do what we want, right? How used to seeing it go the other way are you? We get screamed at by other media and Republican leadership. You got to compromise, which inevitably means do what the Democrats want and smile about it. Well, I'm not going to do that. And I'm not ready to do that. And right on crime, we don't advocate that approach. We want to get a bill done right, not just get something done, meaning passed. So that's the approach we take, that I take. Conservatives bring different things to the table. a good chunk of the conservative movement, their main motivation is their faith, which I appreciate and am part of that. And this is really an outstanding opportunity for a place where we can apply our faith principles to policy. Frankly, we should always do it without embarrassment, but even without attack here. The notion that no one is beyond redemption is critically important in this area. And there's a simple statistical reason. 95% of the people in prisons today across America are coming out. Do you want them to come out better or worse? I want them to come out better. And we're spending a lot of money holding them there to keep us safe, which is part of the point. But if we can keep ourselves safe and make them better citizens when they come out, that is getting more bang for the buck. It's also lowering our future crime rates. Recidivism is the sort of benchmark measurement in this area. Again, because the right has credibility on criminal justice reform, really on public safety, we can lead in ways the left cannot. Frugality, same thing. You know the problems with the left as partners. They're overly rhetorical. They abandon facts all the time. Their narrative isn't factual. It's also very often intentionally racially charged. They are being intentionally divisive, and they're using rhetoric that is not only inaccurate, it actually undercuts what ought to be the goals. Things like Jim Crow rhetoric, and of course I come from Virginia, a southern state where that has some history. Mass incarceration, phrases like that. There was mass incarceration in America, but the last time it happened, it was of Japanese Americans during World War II. Each case in our criminal justice system is decided one case at a time. That is not mass incarceration. And the single greatest statistic to predict likelihood of criminality is family dysfunction. The greater the family dysfunction, the higher likelihood of participation in criminal activity. Who more than conservatives can prioritize family preservation and point out that among its many benefits is a lower crime rate and better lives for those people who might otherwise go down that path? Now, again, I started in juvenile justice reform, and so that's something that I've looked at for a long time, worked a lot on gangs in Virginia when I was Attorney General. And I've seen the divisiveness here, and I've seen the reality that crime brings to every neighborhood, to every community. But since the left uses race to charge things so much, I do want to leave you with one particular, or a couple of quick facts. One, when you're looking at a black criminal, the left treats that person often as a victim. The reality is that person has victims. They're called crime victims. And guess what color they are? Black. If you're looking at a white criminal, guess what color, statistically, that person's victims are? White. And Hispanic is the same, Asian is the same. When you look at the crack cocaine discussion, do you know who drove those higher penalties? Black legislators in the 70s. Charlie Rangel, that noted racist, chaired a joint subcommittee that advanced that legislation. Do you know why? Because the people in black communities were suffering the ravages of crack cocaine worse than anyone else. Worse than anyone else. Black criminal, black victim. White criminal, white victim. Hispanic criminal, Hispanic victim. Asian criminal, Asian victim. Those are the statistics. And when it comes to police, the use of force, 32%, this is my latest statistic, of police deaths are African American, but African Americans represent 30% of arrests. Now, that's awfully close statistically. The real question is, why are they so disproportionately represented in arrests? And the reality is because they have the greatest level of broken families in our society. So while that gets a lot of media attention, the data shows us where that's coming from. President Obama, I mentioned he really wants to sign a bill. He is part of the problem. When you tell people you're going to release 6,000 prisoners early, and when you start commuting and pardoning seemingly willy-nilly, while using racially charged rhetoric that is not factually accurate, boy, do you make life hard for conservatives who would like to actually reform the criminal justice system. Because our fellow conservatives, including some of you in this room, who just think we should be tougher, 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 pounce on that. Pounce on it. And it's a rhetorical disaster. It's a disaster for convincing our fellow Americans of the right way to go. And when you couple that with a current problem where there is rising crime in blue states and blue cities, with a media focus on a lot of the rise in violent crime, Baltimore, Chicago, New York, you can look at the policies that have been implemented there and understand why, and how the police are treated and understand why. Remember Baltimore? We got to give them space to riot. I mean, A, who thinks that, but then who's dumb enough to say it? Woo! So we have to deal with that. In red states, crime is not rising because we prioritize public safety. We are tough on crime where tough on crime is the best solution. And it's obviously the easiest one. You know, I came in the 90s into this when 3 strikes and you're out was a big one. I've learned 3 strikes and you're out is not a great idea. Do you really want to be taking care of geriatric prisoners who really aren't likely to commit any crime anymore, just as a matter of age? The only people who stay criminally active at upper ages, typically, are sex offenders. And I am happy to keep lots of space for the sex offenders in my state. I'm happy to have 1 strike and you're out for those folks because that is the smartest thing to do. You can see on this slide here focus areas for conservatives, including right on crime. Overcriminalization, including asset forfeiture. You know, the federal government doesn't actually know how many crimes it has anymore. When I was suing the NSA and President Obama, which I really enjoyed, I had cause to do some research on part of this subject. In 1790, there were approximately 20 federal offenses, criminal offenses, most of them associated with the mail. And now, when Goodlatte's predecessor, Lamar Smith from Texas, Judiciary Chair, asked the Congressional Research Service to tell him how many federal crimes there were, the answer he got back was, "We do not have enough staff to figure that question out." You think we have overcriminalization? I think we do. And if I'm going to take an extreme example, so don't read into it too much. Take any offense you like. Take murder. Let's take a nice, easy one. If that weren't a federal offense, it would still be prosecuted where it was always prosecuted, by your local prosecutor. Not to say there isn't some role, especially for interstate and international crime, for the federal government, but it is not a necessity that they participate in this. And they are driving, they're not alone, but they're driving very hard the over-criminalization of our society. And the regulatory environment is the worst of all. Regulators have the power, and they shouldn't, have the power to create crimes. I don't think anybody who isn't directly elected should be able to make anything a crime. And this is a major focus for us. One part of this is, you see up on the screen, mens rea. Okay, if you don't speak Latin, it means criminal intent. And many regulatory offenses say nothing about having an intent to do something wrong. Well, the moral component, we're talking about morality. It is crime, right? The moral component, part of the moral component, is the intent to do wrong. One of the simplest ways to cut into overcriminalization is to require criminal intent. This particularly gets at the regulators, and you know this is a good thing because the Democrats don't like it. The Senate put out a criminal justice reform bill that did not include this. The House is talking about putting out a bill that does include it. I would suggest to you that in the federal bill, this difference is the single biggest, and it is huge, the difference this makes, and it is also one of the strongest conservative points that could be advanced into policy that we could see at the federal level. It's an enormous, enormous element of the debate, particularly at the federal level. Other things that we've focused on, and this is a lot of evidence basis for this, is probation versus incarceration. This rolls right into the how tough do you want to be, and we want to be tough enough to make it work. Prison beds should be used for people we're afraid of, not that we're mad at. And that's an important distinction. Prisons have a role to play in keeping us safe, a critically important role, but they're very expensive. So we need to apply them where that matters the most. Incarceration versus a range of alternatives for drug use. Juvenile justice. Just to use rough numbers, using Virginia as an example, to house an adult prisoner in Virginia is about $30,000 a year. Juvenile is $150,000. And in Virginia, we have found that for every year a kid stays in Virginia residential, meaning jail, versus non-residential, their recidivism rate goes up 32% for every year. We're training them to be criminals. Great idea with taxpayer money. And there are ways to solve that. There are ways to solve that. I'll give you some quick examples. I'm going to blow through these. Texas, I already talked about it. They were looking at a $2 billion increase over 5 years. Now we're going back to 2007. Budget drove what they did there. Instead, they spent about $240 million on some of these alternatives, treatment programs within the prison. So they didn't let anybody out. They just treated them while they were a captive, literally, audience. And they started to investigate non-residential alternatives for nonviolent offenders. And it worked. This panoply of changes worked spectacularly well. Their crime rate went down at the same time, and that's both violent crime and property crime, at the same time that their incarceration rate was going down. So they were putting less people in prison and getting lower crime rates at the same time. And I recognize that that's counterintuitive, but the reality is this is about getting it right. Sometimes we do take a sledgehammer to kill a gnat. And budget was the catalyst for this. In North Carolina, I hit the button there and back. All right, Georgia. We're not in Atlanta for RedState, but they had a recidivism rate of about 30% within 3 years. 3 years is the usual measure for recidivism. They didn't like that. They thought that was unacceptable. I would agree with that. They turned and focused some of their bed space on more serious felonies, more serious felons. You can see farther down that they shifted their prison population from about 58% violent offenders, including sex offenders, to about 67%. So they're shifting their money being spent on prisons to more dangerous people, frankly. Their crime rate fell during the same time. Their prison population went down instead of the projected rise with the budget implications that that had. And again, they did this by utilizing some sentencing alternatives that they had never used before, evidence-based again, in addition to focusing their prison space on selected worse criminals, frankly. Again, North Carolina was expecting a $2 billion budget increase in this area, corrections, for a 7-year period. This was looked at in about 2010. So in 2011, they enacted some criminal justice reforms, and that by 2015, instead of rising by 8,500 over the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, their prison population had dropped by about 10%. And this is a tough area. Probation, prison for probation violations. This is a perniciously difficult thing to deal with. And what's interesting is what's been found is the best way to deal with it is the toughest way of all. As soon as you violate probation, boom, you get a punishment. Immediately. Immediately. And their probation back to prison dropped by 2/3, their rate. Again, and that's using being tough on crime in the right way. They saved $64 million by that year. And remember, this is during a period when they thought their budget was going to be exploding. By this year, they've estimated they've saved about $165 million from those reforms. So what I want to urge you all to do in your media capacity, in your teaching capacity, in the way you talk about subjects and issues that come up, you can help us do the right thing. And the right thing is a complicated thing. This is not A or B. There's a lot of variables here. There's budget. There's keeping people safe. There's distinguishing between types of prisoners and likelihood of doing wrong again, and what those wrongs are not the same. If someone's going to litter again, I can tolerate that a lot more than I can letting a sex offender out who may offend again. But our leadership, conservatives' leadership in this area, is consistent with what we believe. Personal responsibility, that no one is beyond redemption. Our, hopefully, inclinations to frugality, especially with other people's money, which is where we are when we're talking about the public's money, taxpayers' money. And of course, all this is done while maintaining the priority of public safety. That is something conservatives credibly bring to the table because we've always done it. We've been leaders in that area, and there's no reason we can't continue to do that. I would also, as a side note, comment that, as you see here, good policy is good politics. We don't have to give up an inch of what we believe. We don't have to back off on any of our principles, and attacking a subject area where we can expand our base and, frankly, just deaden some of the attacks against us that are effectively used oftentimes against our candidates without sacrificing our principles. So I hope you all will kind of move our way, those of you that aren't already with us. For those of you that believe that you're kind of in the knee-jerk, tougher category, you pay for it, you know? If you haven't gotten the memo, we're bankrupt. And when people ask me, well, where would you cut? The answer is everywhere. That's the only responsible answer. And conservatives can lead in this area more credibly than anybody else. Mike Lee is doing this at the federal level. You saw Governor Perry, who has become a real champion nationally for this, with Texas's leadership, which came out of their legislature. They have really carried this forward around the country. Right on Crime is a project of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which was intimately involved in that whole effort. So I hope you all will join us. I have time to take one question. Boom, you got the hand up first.
Why do we allow sanctuary cities in the United States?
So the question was, why do we allow sanctuary cities in the United States, including with all the crime problems this causes? This is a classic, to me, left-right problem, although I lump in Republican leadership on the left. I don't think of them as being on the right. Mitch McConnell has not done anything to preserve us from sanctuary cities and states. And so he's on the left on this. And they cause all kinds of criminal problems. If you live in one of those areas, life is worse for you. Your public budgets are worse. Your quality of life is worse. Beyond ideologically driven left-wing, nuttiness, frankly, I don't have an explanation for you. I mean, conservatives fight it. I mean, it violates the rule of law. It's stupid budgetarily. It's foolish from a public safety standpoint. I mean, there's no redeeming value to preserving or establishing sanctuary cities or states. None. Zero. Certainly not in the criminal justice arena. I'm now going to take my Right on Crime hat off and put my president of the Senate Conservatives Fund hat on. It's a much more combative hat. And this year, of course, we supported Mike Lee, and he got through his primary time, which was the biggest challenge, best senator in the U.S. Senate. But here we're standing in Denver, in Colorado, well, you're sitting, I'm standing, but we're in Denver, Colorado, in one of only 2 states held by Democrat senators with a good chance of being flipped to a Republican. Of course, there are other chances elsewhere, but not as good as Nevada and Colorado. And from a conservative standpoint, the only one that will provide any real value from a principled standpoint and really make any change in Washington is to win with Darrell Glenn right here in Colorado. Now, part of what I'm doing here in Colorado is visiting my brother and sister-in-law who live in El Paso County. And one of their commissioners is Darrell Glenn. And they love him. They can't wait to vote for him to be their senator. He has a spectacular track record, a hometown boy in the sense that he went to the Air Force Academy, served over 21 years in the U.S. Air Force, distinguished career there. He has returned back to Colorado, has served in 2 elected offices here in Colorado, has done an outstanding job, has built a great grassroots campaign, started in early 2015, the good old-fashioned way, one person at a time, one heart and one mind at a time, and built in an entirely volunteer organization a great grassroots campaign. And it is, I just talked about evidence-based for criminal justice reform. It isn't too often, other than polling and this and that, things that none of us completely trust, that you get to actually see evidence of this. Well, we got to see it with Darrell Glenn at the Colorado State Convention in April. For those of you not from Colorado, there are 2 ways to make the ballot in Colorado. You can go through the convention process, and if you get over 30% of the vote in the convention, you're on the ballot. Or you can petition onto the ballot directly. Well, Darrell decided that they were not going to petition. They were going to go earn it with the grassroots activists of Colorado. And I want to say 9 different candidates went that route, including people who were going in the conventional wisdom, believed they would do much better than Darrell Glenn. So with just a 30% requirement, as many as 3 people can make the ballot this way. The problem for the other 8 is Darrell Glenn got over 70% of the vote. 70. Now that's earning it. He has earned it, and then he went on to beat the 4 others, including 2 who put $1 million of their own money into their own races, and he beat them soundly in a 5-way contest by 12 points, 37-25 for the next contender. So he beat him by a 50% margin, meaning of what they got. Now he faces Michael Bennet, an avowed left-winger, though you wouldn't know that necessarily from the TV ads. But isn't that the way it goes? They're left-wingers in Washington, and they're just normal folks back in their home states, right? What a load of malarkey. Well, we've all seen that before, but I would suggest to you that the biggest race for conservatives in America is Darrell Glenn's Senate race. Because we need that kind of immediate, direct reinforcement in the U.S. Senate for people like Mike Lee and Ted Cruz and so on. So it's my privilege and honor both to support Darrell Glenn and to introduce him to you here today. It's afternoon, I can't see, there are no windows. To speak to you about his race himself. And I hope that you leave here with the kind of enthusiasm that we have at the Senate Conservatives Fund. We've raised and spent over $1 million in his race, helped him win that primary, and we're committed to seeing this through the general election, but we need an awful lot of help that you all can help provide. It's a great honor to be able to introduce to you the next U.S. Senator from Colorado, Darrell Glenn.